This last year, it was 61% of the homes in Texas were heated by electricity. And that's a move that a lot of people wanting to clean up the whole environment, not just the power grid, but the energy sector, are trying to do is let's electrify home heating, let's electrify transport, let's electrify a number of other industrial and commercial processes. But we've got to decarbonize first and then electrify all of those things, because sequencing is important to get right. Because what happened here is we moved really quick to have electrified heating, but we didn't have an appropriate system to last for 4 days of extreme cold to actually keep the lights on.
Hello and welcome to Energy Unplugged by Aurora. This podcast features various experts from Aurora having in-depth conversations with key industry leaders, policymakers and academics from all over the world. It explores the hottest topics across the energy market and gives a unique perspective on major energy issues.
Welcome to Energy Unplugged. I'm John Feddersen, founder and chief executive of Aurora. And my guest on the show today has, first of all, had a distinguished career in public service as chairman of the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, FERC, in the US, as chair of the Public Utility Commission of Texas, the PUCT. And in both roles, he had a very strong focus on the power of competition to the benefit of consumers. At PUCT, for example, he was mandated to free up power consumers from monopoly utility control, and he played a major role in designing the modern ERCOT power market. Nowadays, he's predominantly in the private sector as CEO of Hunt Energy Network, who, among other things, focus on grid-scale storage in competitive power markets. My guest on the show today is Pat Wood III, CEO of Hunt Energy Network. Welcome, Pat.
Thank you, John. Glad to be with you in virtual space and talking about my favorite topic.
Wonderful. Excellent. So let's start. I'd like to start. Fascinating career. Can I start? You went to Harvard Law School. Your undergraduate was in Texas. Why did you choose to spend a lot of the early part of your career in the public sector?
Well, my small businessman dad certainly did not program his children to do that. That's just not in our DNA. I had good mentors throughout my life, and one of them was a woman named Gay Baker, who was one of the first women out of my hometown of Port Arthur, Texas, to kind of break out of the traditional female roles and go to law school. And so she was a lawyer for Enron, interestingly, back when they owned pipelines and were in the hard asset space. But she was the regulatory advisor in Washington, D.C., which is where I was working for a law firm after law school, Baker & Botts, Texas-based firm with their D.C. office. And she said to me, "You need to go to FERC." I said, "I don't want to go to FERC. What are you talking about? That's a pay cut." She goes, "Yeah, but they're doing some really interesting things there on natural gas pipeline restructuring. And one of the commissioners there has an opening and he needs somebody like you." So I went and interviewed this guy, and it was, I didn't really want the job, but I wanted to stay in Aunt Gay's good graces. And so he interviewed me the day after Ann Richards beat Clayton Williams for the governorship of Texas, which was kind of a surprise. And Clayton was an Aggie, Texas A&M graduate, good friend of my dad's. They were the same class, 1954. And just a kind of storied oil man with the classic, almost kind of stereotypical West Texas, man-made good kind of story. But he just had he ran a campaign that made a lot of us cringe. Anyway, Ann Richards, who was similarly charismatic and kind of more from the lefty Austin liberal side of the spectrum, won in relatively conservative Texas. And so I was kind of grumpy that day, and I went in for this interview, and he was a Democrat. He was appointed by President Reagan, but that FERC is required to have a balance of parties. And so he checked the Democrat box, and he was a University of Texas graduate. So he was on
he was a Texas Democrat.
The two things that mattered the most, he was on the other side. So politics and where you went to school. Anyway, we had a great interview, but I was just myself, and he liked me as I was because he saw the the kind of discouraged, real side of me. I wasn't trying too hard to impress. And anyway, long story short, he gave me an offer that night, and I never looked back. We got in there and finished the deregulation of the natural gas pipeline industry, which your Economist magazine considered one of the most signal deregulatory efforts of the 20th century. And I could not agree more, because it was one of those efforts similar to the one we're talking about here, where you had a regulated industry for better part of a century, that you're taking the part that still needs to be regulated and continuing to do that, but setting the other parts free and doing it in a thoughtful way that maximizes value to customers, to producers, to the regulated and the unregulated players in the market. And that template for me was really a seminal experience. And so that's really what FERC did. The same thing a few years after I left in '93 to come back to Texas. And I worked at the Railroad Commission at that point for 2 years, and then was appointed by Governor Bush to an open spot on the PUC in '95. So those years were kind of ones of, I was in my late 20s, early 30s, and, a lot of energy and, kind of that.
Yeah, so we'll pick up. I'm really interested in picking up this deregulation story. I agree with the Economist. I mean, the benefits of deregulation in power markets have been substantial. And I suppose the natural question, with the benefit of history now, is why did it stop there and not go further? So we'll come back to that. There are parts of the US that are more regulated than large swathes of sort of Eastern Europe and the former communist states at the moment.
Yes.
So we will pick that up in a second. But just to extrapolate, do you think? So it sounded like it was about being with the right people. If when you're advising people who are graduating now, do you advise people to place a premium in their careers on being around mentors and people they trust over and above the brand or the nature of the role?
I do push the second part, because I personally, when I'm interviewing people, I look at where they worked before, and I do, there's some good brands out there that give people great training and great experiences and exposure to new ideas and business models that are really valuable going forward. But nothing can replace the role of a mentor. Nothing. Yeah. And I have had some wonderful ones through my career. I had President George W. Bush was my last true mentor for 10 years. The first 6, I had a lot more of his bandwidth than I did the last 4 when he was president, his first term. But, those mentors really do help mold and shape you and help you understand how to make good decisions and put together good teams of people that can augment you, how to reach out. One of the best lessons I got from Bush was, consult everybody before you make a decision. Go out, I'm trusting you to figure stuff out, because you'll figure all the details out that I don't want to, get involved in, but you should do that in a way that's broad and consultative. And, that wasn't my style. So I had to change that. And I think I did change it really well by creating a whole lot of public process on our move to deregulation in Texas. And I would say, when talking to a college grad, yes, go for a good brand. First job, generally first jobs always kind of are, not the wonderful freedom and diversity of college years. So the first job's going to kind of be a bump, but offset that as much as you can by doing, interesting work as much as you can, but get with people that'll really be on your side and want you to succeed and go forward. And if that's true, then I think all the rest kind of falls out. In fact, I've got 2 pieces of advice when you're asking that question that made me think. Henry Cisneros, who was a former Aggie Democrat, he was secretary of HUD, but he was the mayor of San Antonio at the time. He said he came and he would come back to Texas A&M and visit with students now and again. And I was in a breakfast with him once, and one of the other kids asked, "What's your best advice for just careers?" And he said, do a great job at whatever you're working on today, and the next thing will come naturally.
Mm-hmm.
And then another person, and I can't remember who it was, said, always leave a job the day before you won't enjoy it anymore. That's always a very hard thing to figure out. But, leave a place and move on with a positive, leave a good taste in their mouth, basically, when you leave, because those people, you'll see them again in your career. And God knows that's been true for me, that, once I've left somewhere, those folks remain my friends and colleagues for today. So I think those two things have kind of been, they sound kind of like a leaf blowing in the wind, but I'm not Presbyterian. I don't believe in predestination. So I kind of do believe in serendipity, and I think my life's kind of been a good case example of that.
Yeah. Well, there's certainly lessons to be learned, I'm sure, given the career you've had. Yeah, I'm sort of tempted to digress on, soliciting feedback before you make decisions and George W. Bush's decision-making processes, but we have to leave that for another time because we need to talk about the power sector. But one other thing from your career that's, you're at Harvard. I'm speaking of good brands at the start of your career. You're at Harvard Law School. You're a Texan from Port Arthur, studied at A&M, which is probably not central casting for Harvard Law School.
It was not.
I may be wrong. And you were the student body president. Do you have a sense of how has student politics changed in the US over the last 30 years? Do you have any observations on how you think? You've obviously got children at university now. How's it changed, if at all?
I think it's become, probably affected very much by social media. I mean, the immediacy of all the social issues that have kind of swept our nation since they did, this has probably been an era of ferment similar to the 1960s, which is a pretty robust, if not tumultuous era for certainly student age people. Again, I came from a conservative undergraduate, went to a very liberal law school. I honestly enjoy, me personally, I enjoy the diversity. I enjoy the challenge of other people and then I'm pretty opinionated. So I love, I guess in the Middle Ages, I would have been a missionary. Love going to, the unwashed and bringing them the good news. But, I was a happy warrior, I guess is the way to think about it at Harvard, and people like that. In those days, I was very much into, student government as a way to make student life better. And so I was very kind of service oriented. We had a really strong council that was very creative in getting good programming, taking care of security issues. We've got, worked with the rest of the university to get the lights put up to really reduce the instances of sexual assault and other criminal activities at night, because a lot of students were at night. So just kind of quality of life stuff was kind of my bread and butter. And I always kind of look at government today and just think of it writ large across the world the same way. As get out of the ideological battles about what people were born looking like, because you can't change that, and work on the stuff you can change, which is how can you make people's lives better and be competent at doing it. So that's what we were doing there in that day and age in the Harvard Law School Council, and I was really proud of our results that year. We got involved in the tenure battle with the president of the university. A woman was denied tenure from the law school, and she was one of my teachers, and so I got pulled into that stuff, advocating on behalf of our students. But by and large, we stuck with, let's deliver services and deliver them well and make quality of life better on concrete, tangible things.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting. Yeah. I was student body president at my Oxford college. And I think the only thing anyone will remember is the rent negotiation that I fronted and knocking 10 quid a week off their rent. So I think in terms of practical, I don't think anyone will remember any of the ideological battles. So I entirely agree. And I like I like your depiction of a missionary, the Texan heading to enlighten the northeastern heathens in Harvard or something like that. Okay, let's talk about the power. So really interesting, lots we could go more into, but let's talk about the power sector. And I will come back to your point about ideology versus practical help, because to some extent, this whole debate about the role of markets in the power sector, I think, has to play out at an ideological level. It's just very hard for people to conceptualize the virtues of competitive markets. And in many ways, it's actually sometimes the practical battles get won by central government control here. And what can a central monopoly do? So anyway, we'll pick that up in a second. But first of all, I wanted to start broad. So in relation to you've been at the state level, and for people who are listening to the podcast, Texas has its own power grid. And part of the virtue of that from a Texan perspective is no federal oversight, right? So FERC doesn't have a role to play in the Texas power grid. You've also been at FERC. Do you have a sort of pithy view of what you think the appropriate role of the federal government in the US is in driving a clean, affordable, reliable power system?
Think about it like a house. You have a civil engineer pour the foundation. And then based on the architect's rules, which have to be synchronized with that foundation directly for the studs and the pipes and the drains and such, a different team comes in and builds a house on top. And the FERC's role is to make sure that that foundation on power markets and gas markets as well, they regulate those. And as I said, I think did a really good job on that. Their job is to really lay that concrete and make it strong and synchronize it, importantly, synchronize it well with the retail markets that are state regulated. So our statutes are a little different between gas and electric, which is a source of probably the core problem here, is that those laws were written in the day and age when we didn't have a lot of interstate power. We didn't have wind coming from Kansas to keep the lights on in Chicago or Philadelphia. And everything was kind of, these local or at least regional, power plants. And so that's really the role, is to lay that foundation so that other things can be built upon it. It's not an end in itself. I do think there's a lot that comes from the wholesale market that on its own, like on natural gas, is really critical. The kind of key issue, of course, is competition between and among power supplies and power demand, and making sure that the optimal solutions come out of that back and forth, that competition between providers of electricity. But really that's the core, is let's get a broad, because most states aren't as large as Texas. And so you have to work with your neighboring states to make sure that you get the benefits of these economies of scale and competition. But I think that's really it, is that FERC lays the foundation and allows the states to build the house.
Yeah. Do you think Texas has benefited from the absence of FERC oversight? I mean, I suppose it's a kind of it's not a randomized control trial, but it's an experiment, at least, I suppose. Could ERCOT have done what it's done with a bigger role for FERC in there? FERC support, the FERC role. I'm probably going to be a bit of a contrarian here. I haven't been in both jobs. I can see the benefits of both. Yes, Texas was able to move faster, but I think any state that wanted to have a retail market like Texas's market has become can do that, and in fact many have, with FERC under building that foundation, as opposed in Texas case, we built the concrete and the house, so we were able to do the full construction project. You have fewer drop balls when you're doing it that way, to be sure. You have one architect doing the whole construction project, so it is easier, to be sure, but it's not at all impossible. We have had a lot of success in the Mid-Atlantic markets, the Midwest ISO. Now we've got these wholesale markets that look a lot like the Texas market in 2/3 of our country. So
it's the last third that I wished I'd have had the bandwidth to finish before I got done at FERC. But in any event, we did get 2/3 done. And so that infrastructure is in place, which supports further state efforts to do what they want with their markets. Some have chosen, like Pennsylvania, New York, New England, to go to full retail competition, as we have in Texas. Others, California tried it, and then in a dramatic reversal that I had to deal with, the part of, dialed it back. Other states are starting to think about it now. Nevada, Arizona have been probably the most recent. Florida might be a hard push, but there's a, I would just say it's really a function of time and attention to detail. And I was fully attentive to those details when we were at FERC. Nora Brownell, who I know you talked to on this podcast earlier, and I were really just soulmates, both at the state level when she was president of all the states in the NARUC role that she had, as well as colleagues at FERC. We were very attentive to those details that make the full market construct work. And, my only regret is that FERC has kind of not focused on that as much since she and I left, as I think they can. I think FERC has a lot of authority to do stuff it's not yet doing yet, but they've had other issues that have been subsequent priorities that I fully appreciate.
Yeah, interesting. Do you think it would take, you talk about attention to detail as being what it would take to see the benefits of liberalization. Do you think it takes a Republican in the White House?
No, I think, my day and age, the Democrats were as good on markets and competition as the Republicans. In fact, sometimes better. It really was kind of a regional deal. Sometimes you'd have Midwestern Republicans that were great, but Western Republicans that distrust the federal government are kind of a different brand. And so, you had to work with them differently. Democrats, similarly, in the Northeast, fully get competition. They see what competition has done to clean up the grid. In fact, that's generally been my approach in talking to folks who are left of center, that if you care about an environment that's got cleaner power plants and, more diverse resources from wind and solar and batteries and what have you, you need to be on the market agenda, because that's how it's going to happen in your lifetime. Not if you put that responsibility fully in the hands of the utility industry, which has been a phenomenally good industry, but is one of the more conservative, probably the most conservative industry in the U.S. economy. So you're not going to get the innovation there that has really driven the deployment of clean energy resources in the competitive regions. I mean, the investment differential is substantial. I mean, I don't think anybody even wants to even argue that that's remotely comparable between regulated wholesale markets and competitive ones.
Yeah, there's something in if you're going to be the guy that gets blamed if the lights go out, there's something in the psyche that means you're not a risk taker and you're going to be slow to adopt innovations. I think you said the biggest the most important thing was attention to detail, and you wish you had the energy to do the other markets. Does that mean, because sometimes when it does feel a bit like an ideological battle in the US from what I see, it feels like there are fairly strong vested interests in general. The one the sort of Warren Buffett and Nora spoke about Warren on the podcast. She's not a massive fan of him, as sort of coming in with and saying, hey, give me a regulated return on 10 gigawatts of gas plants and I'll build them now. So even in Texas, these battles are there. Is it really as simple as attention to detail from the federal regulator, or do you see more fundamental challenges?
To be sure, the vested interest, again, remember this industry has been regulated for a century, and somewhere way back in that century, the goal of regulation transformed from customer protection to monopoly protection. And so those monopolies have gotten extremely politically powerful and economically dominant in their regions. And those I would say that that definitely played a part in the lack of progress on competitive wholesale markets in the U.S. Southeast. You had Florida Power and Light, Duke, Southern Company, Tennessee Valley Authority, and Entergy, kind of I think that's all of them, the big dominant players there that had very, they had a relationship with their regulators that was just where they wanted it. And, their rates weren't that far out of line. So, and they got really healthy returns on equity. And, that's the thing competition does, is it whittles down that return. So it is, it is a challenge for me as the advocate for this to really make the sell to those corporate boardrooms that they needed to do this because it was, good for Georgia or good for Oklahoma or Arizona. I mean, those moneyed interests are strong and have been very successful so far in delaying the entry of something that was going to knock down their returns. So I'm not naive. That was the hardest part of the job.
Yeah. Okay.
We unfortunately had an electricity blackout in 2003, directly halfway through my term at FERC, that a quarter of our continent was blacked out. So my goals really switched from promoting competition and developing competitive power markets to the reliability function, which is a key is the twin sister of that first agenda. So fortunately, we laid some groundwork for that, and I think that's worked out well too. But that was a tough hit.
Yeah, those blackouts change the priorities, and it's sort of, I do think there's a political economy point here. You're an economist will tell you, look, there's an optimal number of hours of lost load in any given year. We don't want to build too much capacity. But I think once you do the political economy overlay and you realize that every blackout can set back the agenda by 5 years or 10 years, you say, it's peanuts to even be talking about the cost of building an extra gigawatt or two, or however you do that. It's just keep the lights on, and then we can have a sensible conversation, because I've seen so many countries. It was London a few years ago. It was Australia a few years before that. It's obviously Texas, where I suppose still in the middle of sorting out, and maybe we'll talk about that. Where yes, there's obviously a major human cost and an economic cost, but the cost in terms of the policy distraction and the debates that happen is very large.
Yep, good point.
Yeah, the other reflection, I think, Europe, to some extent there are parallels, right? Because Brussels and the European Commission has been a very big driver of liberalization in European markets and harmonization of balancing and these types of things. And so even in those markets where the head of state wants to be able to call up, like Ireland or like France, where the head of state wants to be able to call up a state-owned utility and say, hey, are the lights going to stay on this winter? There is competition around the fringes, and you have these coexisting, and there's a sort of vibrant competitive market with big state-backed players. So it can be done. Good. What just one other question then on a little bit on the federal thing. So another way of framing the role of federal government is so the president Joe Biden has one of his election commitments was a net zero grid by 2035 or something along those lines. Hugely ambitious given where the US at the moment is. What would you see as the biggest impediment to him realizing that vision? If there was one constraint that you relaxed, what would it be that would help him get there?
I think it's the talismanic focus on net zero. I think we could get to a grid that's substantially more clean. I call it the 80% solution. I don't know if 20, if that's really the right number, but Texas is moving probably by 2035, that 80% of the hours of the year, our prices are going to clear at zero from the zero variable cost dispatch resources of nuclear, wind, and solar.
Yeah.
And we may well be at the forefront of that. I'm not sure that's where I want Texas to be at the front. I've always enjoyed learning from other people's mistakes to make a good market design, because ours was all cobbled together from prior lessons learned by other people. But we're going to have to figure that out. So I think, yes, if we did carbon capture and sequestration, could keep the gas plants around for sure, and probably some coal plants. If that's a successful technology, I haven't seen it yet. I'm praying and hopeful for it. But after February's experience in Texas, I really dialed back my enthusiasm for a net zero grid, because I want those resources around for that hot August and that cold February to keep my power on. And and then the other thing about that timeline. So I think the direction is actually where it's going anyway. If the government wants to give a little nudge on that through the tax credits, I wish they would move on from the tax credits, because they do distort markets. But they're distorting them, and they're picking an outcome, which I'm not thrilled about. But we've managed to work around it fine. But the February event in Texas showed me that we have got to really integrate the reliability aspect of power much more deeply than we have been talking about up to now. As we move to a clean grid, it's not just as simple as shutting down a coal plant and building some wind farms to make up for it, because those intermittent resources are not as dependable, and they're certainly not dispatchable yet. If you probably need a lot of batteries to level that up. It looks like California is taking that approach with their 11 gigawatt order of recent days. So perhaps batteries can solve that problem. I'm a battery fan, as you know, but so that's one. And then I think the other thing is the sequencing. And I saw this is an issue that hasn't popped up as much from the Texas experience, but is worth delving into. Is when I was a kid, about 10% of the homes in Texas were heated by electricity. Most of us use natural gas because it's all here, or there's not much heating oil like you'd have in New England, like I had in Boston. But it was small. This last year, it was 61% of the homes in Texas were heated by electricity. And so we have, and that's a move that a lot of people that are wanting to clean up the whole environment, not just the power grid, but the energy sector, are trying to do. So let's electrify home heating. Let's electrify transport. Let's electrify a number of other industrial and commercial processes. But we've got to decarbonize first and then electrify all of those things, because that sequencing is important to get right. Because what happened here is we moved really quick to have electrified heating, but we didn't have enough an appropriate system to last for 4 days of extreme cold to actually keep the lights on. And so that's got to, so we've got to be a little less in a jihad against natural gas as a country, as a world, because we do need dispatchable fuels to keep the lights on through this transition. And then as technology will, as it has for so many things in our life, John, we'll solve this problem as we go forward, whether it's through CCCS or through advances in long duration batteries. All these things together, I think in the next 20 years are going to be able to plug that gap. But I think we have to be mindful more of the reliability component of this than we had been, at least in my mind, before February, because everybody is looking at Texas and going, wow, that's probably one of the fastest decarbonizing grids we've got in the world anywhere. And look what happened to them. So learn our lessons, please, and sequence it and pace it.
Yeah, interesting. And that heat decarbonization challenge obviously gets harder the further from the equator you get it. So you get this very
well. Very, I mean, it was half of when the lights went out. Half, I calculated on the back of an envelope, half of that demand was residential home heating. Half of the 69 gigawatts that it was on Valentine's Day night last year was to keep the heat on. And then it just got worse because it got colder that night. Everybody went to bed and their heaters kick in on automatic. And, the heater has to use more electric resistance heating the colder it gets. And that's the most inefficient way of using energy that I could ever think of. Whereas natural gas, the nice thing about it is it's 100% of the heat value of the gas is what you consume at your house. Yeah. And if you're using electricity, you waste half of it at the power plant, and then probably another good fraction of that prior to getting a warm room.
Yeah, and it's it's interesting, and I entirely agree. You know, my mantra is the first 8,000 hours of decarbon a year is easy, and the last 800 hours is difficult. And I think there are a lot of politicians in the world who have been told, you know, the levelized cost of solar is $30, which is true in Texas or something like that, and the power price is 50. So we should be able to decarbonize our grid. But of course, it's not that simple, and those 800 hours are not hours in which the levelized cost of solar is low. It's
you know,
infinite.
we've got to. I think we've got to adjust the curve for grading and decide that the 80% solution is an A+ for the world, and we'll be okay with the 20% because the trade-off there is people die, and public services go to pot when you don't have power.
Yeah. Is that to say you think humanity, I mean, a consequence of the 80% solution rather than 100% solution is the world will keep warming up a bit, you know, if you accept the science? Is that saying humanity can adapt to a moderate amount of warming, and actually that might be the optimal approach?
Well, you're sitting here. I'm in a sweatshirt in Texas on a day in January. No, again, I do think that technology will allow us to will give us solutions that aren't cost effective today. I mean, remember, just 20 years ago, solar wasn't even remotely on the chart of cost effectiveness, and now it's come plummeting down. I do think I do have faith in technology. I don't want to sound like a mindless anti-Luddite, but I do think there's a lot of potential and promise, and I do strongly support our federal government's efforts to continue that kind of research and development through the Department of Energy and other parts of our country to figure out the next best thing, because it's worked pretty well. We figured that out on solar. We figured it out on batteries. A lot of wind technology was incubated in the federal government labs as well as in the private sector, and that's a healthy balance that we've got to continue to support.
Yeah. So one final question on a sort of industry-wide question, and it's about, I suppose, your time at PUCT. You're, as I said, you architect of ERCOT, a modern ERCOT, which is a template that others have tried to emulate. As much as you want to be the follower, others have emulated what you've tried to do around the world as well. What's your biggest regret? If you're a believer in regrets, what's your biggest regret from your time at the PUCT?
And obviously this was informed by what happened in February, because my regret list was shorter on February the 14th than it was on February the 15th. But I'll give you my current list. As I wish, when we were during my tenure at PUC, we were preparing for a worldwide event called Y2K, which I know some of your listeners don't even know what that is. But that was computer program code that only recognized the 2-year digit for the calendaring purposes. And they were worried when we went from December 31st, 1999 to January 1st, 2000, that all the computers were going to collapse. So we started about 4 years early, and, the world redid the computers, and that ended up being a non-event. But we didn't know. That was, my wife still kind of holds that grudge that I wasn't there with her the night we had New Year's Eve changing the millennium. But we were in the ops center to make sure that all of Texas stayed on. And, we had a few little issues. It wasn't zero, but it was not important. And that kind of preparation, that kind of drill running, that should be just endemic to all of our industries, is always prepare for the worst. I do that as a member of some corporate boards, is we always have the emergency plan. What happens if the CEO gets hit by a truck? What happens if we have an explosion at a plant and people die? Just preparing for every type of emergency. And part of that is, one of the ones we had here was our utilities were told they've got to cut load. Well, those plans came off the shelf, but they were dusty. We hadn't had to do that kind of rotating outage thing, and it was such a substantial cut that there wasn't much of an ability to rotate. And so some people were off for 70 hours in the city of Austin, for example, because that utility just didn't have the nobody imagined it would be 20 gigawatts. I mean, the biggest we've ever had to cut was 5 gigawatts for 6 hours, and that was 10 years ago. So people grumbled about that, and it was dramatic, but it was, people didn't die. But, this was a totally different scale and scope of this thing. So I would say that's one big regret, is that we really didn't build in the emergency op mindset and keep it current and front burner. That's where it's got to stay for every business. And cybersecurity is a new angle now. And, all the terrorism type of things, I need to bake all that into utility oversight. And then the second is what I call the Southwest Airlines analogy. And I noticed with regret that Stephen Breyer is stepping off the Supreme Court, but before he was a famous jurist, he was a staffer for Senator Ted Kennedy back in the 70s during the great deregulations of a lot of our economy. He was the staff counsel to the Judiciary Committee in charge of changing the laws of the U.S. to allow for, among other things, the deregulation of the airline industry. And so Justice Breyer really was a key player there. And he taught at Harvard too. So I sat in on his class. I wasn't lucky enough to actually get him for my teacher, but we were allowed to audit his class. And he was such a giant back then that we were all clamoring to sit in the back row and listen in on his administrative law discussions. But anyway, the airline industry, when they swapped it out, they looked ahead and said, people are going to have an incentive to cut costs. And we need to say, here's a line over which you can't walk on safety, because we don't want people to die. We don't want airplanes to go. We don't want maintenance, all that. So they set at the onset of competition, they set the thou shalt not line with regard to maintenance. And had we done that with regard to power plants in Texas, I think, not just in 2011 when we got the wake up call, but really at the onset, if we'd have really looked at not just other power markets, but other industries and said, what do you do when you're breaking something apart that's worked really well and you want it to continue to work that well in a competitive environment? What are going to be the pressures? And obviously the pressure to cut costs is relentless in the power industry, certainly in ERCOT. And, backup dual fuel tanks, most every gas generator had them. They had heating oil in a tank, or not much liquefied natural gas, honestly, but those heating oils were heating oil tanks were in every gas facility, and those got yanked out because they weren't cost effective after 95 or so. And so that would have been a savior for us had we had backup gas on site for the majority of our large gas-fired plants. Maybe not 4 days. I'm not sure. That, again, it was a very prolonged freeze down here, but that kind of directional things. That's what I wish we'd have thought about. What can we learn about what lines can we draw that we say on behalf of the public interest, you cannot do this.
Yeah, the airline analogy is a really good one, right? Because sometimes what you hear in ERCOT is, look, it's human nature. Look, we'll prepare for the first year after the storm area, the second year, but then we'll forget about it. And it's like,
right.
It's like there have been years recently with zero crashes in aviation globally. And people are preparing, every flight, people prepare for it, even though it never happened. So it can be done, which is interesting.
So those are my two regrets.
Two big regrets.
Is really I would call it, the short term is weatherization. This is what you have to do to weatherize, but more broadly, this is the operational parameter. This is we don't get below this line on anything to do with reliability. And then secondly, the emergency preparations for when you actually do cross that line by whatever reason, you can adapt, and your contingencies are provided for by your redundancies throughout your system.
And is that to say you think when the outages were rotating, we were rotating the wrong things out and for the wrong durations?
Oh yeah, downtown Houston was ablaze with light. Well, who the hell was working at 3 a.m. on February the 15th? That should have been dark, and that should have been diverted to I call them the barrios, and kept people alive. But our systems were not configured. To be fair to the utilities, they're not heartless or stupid. Their lines are what they are. The topography of the distribution system is different in every part of the world, but you've got a hospital on the same line as a probably a automobile dealership or something, and so you don't you're cutting power off to. You can't cut power off to the auto dealer without cutting off the hospital. So who wants that?
Yeah, or the gas compressor stations or something.
The gas like that. Yes, exactly. The processing plants.
It was for what it's worth. It was the same with the London. I mean, much smaller blackouts and caused by a couple of plant trips in 17 or 18. And they I think it's 7. The distribution networks had sort of 7 levels of contingency that would get you through 60% load shed. So massive load shed. There was a hospital on one, there was an airport on another, and they just sort of cut a couple of the wrong ones out because I think they hadn't revisited it for a few years. So it's an interesting lesson. So I'd just like to talk about a couple of things to do with your current roles now. So Hunt, you're huge stature in the power sector in the US. You could have done all sorts of things. You've decided to dedicate a significant proportion of your professional time at the moment to grid scale battery storage. Can you tell me what's your vision for this? What do you find exciting about the potential for batteries in the US grid?
Having regulated natural gas, I see just how important the ability to store your commodity is. And we've never had that. If I'd had that as a regulator, I think a lot of the rules we set up, particularly on things like market power and system dispatch and all that, would have looked very different had we had the ability to store our product like we had on the natural gas system. And so, this is a product that moves at the speed of light. And so you don't have that time lag kind of benefit that sometimes you have with gas and gas pack on a pipeline and such. So that I like being on the front edge of stuff because that's again, I guess to tie back to my missionary role, you're a great person to help on self-analysis. Here I am at 59 trying to figure out how I am the way I am. But I like being in that uncharted territory where the rules haven't yet been written and where a lot of future uplift or optimism exists. And I think storage is clearly that area today. That and integrating demand response, integrating the user's consumption of the product. Because again, it's always flowed in real time up to now. And now that ability to do a time shift on that is pretty interesting. So I like that. I mean, to me, that's where I want to be. That's where I need to be. That's where I think our grids need to be as well, is looking at storage and looking at how storage and load interplay and how that really is the rest of the agenda to the modern power grid needs those two pieces. I don't, and we can talk about hydrogen or other stuff that can go in there, but that's just an input to the system. But the fundamental contours of the power system lack these two areas, which are storage, time deferral, I call it, and participation of the load or direct price signaling to the load, so that we manage load and supply in a dual way, as opposed to just we are here to supply demand, which is how the system has been for a century. So I like that. There's a lot of people out there who want to fund that. So that's where I like to be.
Yeah, interesting. We could have a conversation about, and this podcast has talked about the virtues of nodal pricing in general. It's not a debate in Texas at the moment, but certainly in parts of Europe. How do you reflect the need? How do you reflect something that demand can respond to on a locational basis? And how can you reflect the value of batteries for easing congestion? Are two answers to which nodal pricing is an answer. And I'd love to pick your brain on that, but we don't have time right now, Pat. But I assume you're a nodal pricing enthusiast.
Absolutely. I wish Texas had gotten there sooner than we did. But yes, PJM, was the fair-haired child when I was at FERC, because they were innovative and creative and very responsive to a lot of the most current trends going across power grids around the world. And so we learned a lot from each other when I was at FERC and nodal pricing. There are some issues with that politically when you do nodal pricing for the end user. But, even Texas voted I think just last month, that they want to move to nodal pricing at the consumer end for certainly the larger customers, which I think provides that kind of price signaling to people like me, storage, and also to demand response and to other kind of smaller scale innovations that are really starting to populate the grid, to be surgical about where you put them. It's not just enough to plop a plant somewhere in Texas and say, I've solved a problem. It's where you plop it. And it's solved the problem really, not just from a raw energy point of view, but from reactive power and from congestion. So all those things really get a lot of price signaling when you make the pricing as disaggregated as you can.
Speaking of nodal pricing and the basis on which batteries are investable in the US, the two hottest markets at the moment for batteries in terms of gigawatts deployed are CAISO and ERCOT, as I see it. Now, they're very different approaches. So ERCOT, we were seeing half-hour duration batteries. We're seeing one. We're starting to see two being built predominantly into an ancillary services type model, providing sort of very fast response, high value power in the right locations. In California, there's sort of government mandates, there's an they call it the RA contracts, and essentially government is mandating load serving entities to procure long duration batteries. And so we're seeing 4 and 8 hour batteries. You, Hunt Energy Network, you're focusing very much on Texas. What are your reflections? I mean, is there a reason you've chosen to deploy capital in Texas versus California from a regulation perspective? And more broadly, do you think the Californian approach is a sensible one as well, given the number of batteries we're going to need?
Wow. My heart's been broken so many times in California. It's hard to ever think about wanting to do business there as a first thing. I might get good enough in Texas that we'll go missionary in California. But, again, one of the pitches I've made for 15 years since I left FERC is there are two ways to kind of get to, fill in the blank: clean power agenda, modern grid, et cetera. It can be driven from the top, which is what I call kind of the Obama plan, and with the EPA that's now before the court, and California, where you've got the government deciding these are the outcomes and specific outcomes that we want. Or you can have a customer pool, which is the Texas market. Like, open it up. Texas never really did much other than some very broad brush renewable portfolio standards to get renewable power in the system. But yet, because it's the most cost-effective solution, it just came here in spades. Plus, we have a tremendous wealth of resource. I mean, God gave Texas so much in the energy arena that we're just, if we can't make money off of it, we're stupid. So that has been, what is a driver, I think, in all of these things is what model is most effective. And so I always thank the Californians every time I get a chance for what they did to support the nation's R&D in wind and solar and now storage, because they put so much ratepayer money behind it. But that comes at a cost. And so do you want to do it just to do it, or do it to solve a problem at any price, or do you want it to be done as cost effectively with competitive players as you can? And it's too hard for me to walk away from my market background, because I've seen it work so many places, and this agenda as well. My report card is, let's look at the California model and the Texas model. Cost: California high, Texas low. Renewable deployment: Texas high, California medium high. Technological innovation: I'd say California high, Texas medium-ish. Although interesting business innovations going on. And then reliability, we're both low. So I think that's just a function of the fact that both of our grids are moving very quickly to renewables, and we haven't figured out the reliability component. But you and I've talked about that earlier in this podcast. So, I would posit that, fundamentally, my job as a regulator was to worry about economic development. I mean, Bush didn't tell me that when he hired me, but at the core of its being, that's what a regulator of any sort, whether it's the Securities Exchange Commission or, the FERC or the PUC, your job is to think about how do we serve our citizens best and create good jobs and create dependable foundation on which everybody else's jobs can thrive. And so I do care about the cost. I mean, the cost of deployment of new storage, of new solar, of new, again, I hope we get to the carbon sequestration world of new and clean coal and gas, wind, hydroelectricity, name it all, geothermal, which I like to think with all those holes that we Texans have punched looking for oil, we could do something with those holes for geothermal, but we'll have that on another call, I suppose. But, all those things kind of fold in together and should result in at least a reasonable cost. If not, in our case in Texas, we found out that renewables actually dropped the cost because even with the subsidy did distort that somewhat. The wind subsidy is volumetric as opposed to the subsidy that's given to solar, which is capital credit. But our wholesale power prices have plummeted because we have the pressure from zero variable cost wind in every hour of the day, pushing it down. So that's a win for customers, to be sure. Our industrials are absolutely thrilled. They are very pro-renewable because they saw what it did to their power bills. But, the providers, not so much. The gas-owned power plants aren't so thrilled by that. But, by and large, we ought to structure this and sequence this as best we can. Again, market is driving it, but the rules can nudge the market. I'm not so Republican. I ignore the role of government in this business. I think that the sequencing and the timing can really, if done right, result in a real consumer surplus, that we don't have to talk as we used to interview people. Would you pay more to have a green electricity contract from your retailer? Well, hell, those are the cheapest ones on the Texas market today. Because people, you're not paying more, you're actually getting it for cheaper. And so people that once they figure that out, they become like me and just want to tell everybody, even at a cocktail party, do you have green power on your plant? Oh, were you one of those? Are you one of those liberals? I'm like, no, I'm just a person that likes to save money. Yeah, that's the world that, I think the folks that are, pro renewables are missing, is that if pitched and done right, it can be a win, not just for the environment, but for the pocketbook. And the sooner people figure that out, the quicker this moves out of the ideological realm and into the practical realm of just make life better for the people. And then we move on.
Yeah. So you're doing it in spite of the social hit you take in Houston, Texas, because it's the lower cost.
Yeah, I got dinged for driving my electric car around, and they go, oh, well, that's not surprising. I will say, well, I'm a power guy. This is exactly what I need to be doing. Are you kidding?
Very good. Excellent. So, and it's interesting. I mean, you opened with on the California. It sounds like Californian battery developers don't have to worry too much about competition from Hunt Energy Network over the imminently, but breaking hearts. It's an interesting one. We had Peter Crampton on, who was an ERCOT director, I think, before ERI, professor, distinguished professor, and he sort of made that point of it's very hard to trust policy because it can move a lot. But if with markets, at least you know what the rules of the game are. With nodal pricing, you know what the algorithm is. And so his argument was, okay, you might have a more volatile system, but investors are actually more comfortable knowing that the rules of the game aren't going to change in arbitrary ways on them. So, yeah.
And Peter's great. I think that was a real disservice to the state that we restricted our board of governors to Texans. But I will say the quality of the 6 or 8 that we got just in the last 2 months is superb. So fortunately, Texas is a big enough state where we can find 6, or I think it's 8 good people to do the oversight of ERCOT going forward. But the point the point is valid because we have not really changed the market design major parameters in Texas since I was here. So it's been 25 years. So I walked into the new commissioners. I said, just representing the old guard, it's time to rethink it. Said, you will not disrupt the industry. As a member of that, now that I've been on the private sector side of the fence for 17 years, do it. It's wise to do it. The world has changed. The assumptions on which our market model was formed have evolved, and there might be some changes you need to make. So do it in a public process, just like we did. And Chairman Lake is doing just that, doing it beautifully. It's painful to watch sometimes. People kind of grapple in public that think differently about things, but that people that provides the certainty that investors need. Is you see not only what the rules are, but why they are. You see the people who are deciding them grapple with the implications, pro and con of everything. And I think that's a real service, is to have that transparent sort of government in making policy. So I loved it. I loved doing it when I was there. It was tedious. It required a different skill set than God gave me when I was born. But, you have to evolve, and you have to learn how to be a problem solver from day one.
And it doesn't happen everywhere that the old guard says, hey, we need to move with the times. They say there's that famous saying in academia, academia progresses one funeral at a time. And I think certainly the Australian system, at least, there was sort of the sense that the architects thought this was such a beautiful system, in spite of the fact that technology in the world had changed, that things maybe changed a bit more slowly. We had to import an American in Audrey Zibelman, who's also been on the podcast, to throw a few bombs and shake things up a bit and change things around.
I had an old priest once that said, put out the message to people. Don't require them to do anything. But if you don't have the best message, then you shouldn't be sitting there. So if we don't have the best market design, we should be man enough or woman enough to admit that and let the truth fall. If our truth is immutable, then it'll rise to the top. If it's needing revision, I'd sure rather be on that side of the fence than in the old guard, because God knows I've spent a career tugging a war and with the old guard on the other end of the rope. God, that's no fun for them, because they ultimately get in the mud. The best ideas do win out, I do think, and I've seen it in history. Does move jaggedly but upward, and I think we all want to be on the right side of history.
Good. So what I normally do, in fact, what I always do, is I conclude the show by giving you a few concepts in the energy transition and asking you if you think they're overrated or underrated. Just as a way of, anyone can say something is good or bad, but is it good relative to what people think is a sort of slightly, do you beat the line basically in betting, in football bet? I know you're a football fan. In football betting terms, sort of, is it overrated or underrated? So let me start with the role of so I think I know the answers to a lot of these, actually, having spoken to you for an hour. But the role of markets in decarbonizing the power sector. Do you think that's an overrated concept or an underrated concept?
I think it with current decision makers, it is underrated.
Mm-hmm. Okay, very good.
I think a lot in the industry know it, and so they say that is the way to do it. And I would not say anybody is overrating that.
Yeah. Okay, good. The role of gas as a transition fuel to a low carbon power sector, overrated or underrated?
I would say, with the reliability concerns that have been faced in Texas, California, other power markets around the globe, that the role of gas has been underrated. I do think it's undergoing a bit of refurbishment from some, but I think it's got more to do to get back in that front seat to where it's appropriately recognized as a transition fuel.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So the third concept I have is the potential for batteries to replace networks and copper wires in reducing congestion and integrating renewables. Do you think the potential for batteries on the network congestion front is overrated or underrated?
I would say, again, being in that business, I hear so many pie in the sky views of what batteries can do in the near term that I would say it's overrated in the near term as far as fixing congestion and renewable integration, but probably is underrated in the long term. I think as we get a lot of refurbishment of the power grid rules that make those things all a lot more crisp, that will evolve. But I think right now there's a euphoria about batteries will solve everything. I know for sure they won't.
Yeah.
But as the grid kind of equilibrates and as policy kind of settles back down, and maybe as we settle for, the 80% solution on the clean energy side, we also have a more pragmatic view about what batteries can do. And then we start to mine the batteries and realize, oh my God, I was just on a call this morning when I saw what we did to voltage spikes overnight. Our units did not trip off as we expected they would have with fluctuations on that part of the grid. Is they actually stabilized it. It's like, well, crap, we need to get paid for that. We did something really meaningful for reliability, and we just did it for free.
Yeah.
But so I do sense that those stories will come out as we learn a lot more about the deployment of this really new resource. Again, 2-3 years ago, John, batteries were above the price in the market. We didn't even think about it. And then when they started to come down, that's when I said, I want to put together a business on this. And so I talked to my colleagues and we started a business because that cost of that resource really got in the sweet spot. They're still a little high, but they're ready to play with. And I do sense that euphoria that happened in, I would say, 19 and 20 before COVID, that euphoria is still around, but it'll flag, and then it'll kind of come back to, I think, equilibrium that is, again, for me, fun to be part of, because it will be that tool that we've never had, the tool and absolutely the tool we need to address both the congestion and the integration of renewables issues as those become bigger and bigger concerns across the power grid. So that's a good complex one on underrated or overrated.
Yeah. And I think there's something, without wanting to get too philosophical. So Bill Gates famously said of technologies, we tend to overestimate progress over 2 years, but underestimate progress over 10 years.
There you go.
And I
think that's exactly right. I think that's exactly the answer. I should have given you that answer pithily at the front end.
No. But I think it's actually something about the second derivative. I think humans are good with velocity. We're bad with acceleration. Compound interest is the eighth wonder of the world. All of these things, there's something fundamental, human blind spot to compound growth, technology, cost curves, all of these things. Anyway, that's getting far too philosophical for the podcast.
But beautifully said, and beautifully said with the mother tongue accent. That'll get me through the rest of a beautiful day. That's great.
Okay, good. Well, I will, on that note, and it looks like it's a beautiful day in College Station, Texas today, I will conclude things. So it was a real pleasure, Pat, to hear your unique perspectives from business, from the public sector, and from a career in the power markets. So Pat Wood, thanks so much for taking the time to speak.
It was a joy. Thank you, John.
That was John Feddersen, founder and chief executive of Aurora, speaking to Pat Wood III, CEO of Hunt Energy Network. Do keep an eye on our podcast feed for more in-depth conversations with senior members of the energy industry. The best way to do this is to subscribe on whatever platform you use. Thanks for listening, and goodbye.